It is highly recommended that parents with children watch this movie before it is too late to regret it. This father is facing the most difficult choice of his life. A few days ago, he went to the hospital for a checkup, and the doctor told him he has cancer with only 3 months left to live. For his son's future, he must personally give him up for adoption. 3-year-old Michael does not understand the meaning of this question. His innocent answer breaks John's heart, but he cannot bring himself to tell his son that his father is dying and can no longer take care of him. The adoption agency staff advises him that even if he does not want his child to face death so early, he should prepare a memory box in advance to leave his son something to remember him by. Moreover, when the child turns 18, he will have the right to learn about his biological parents, and these items will be very useful then. However, John disagrees. He would rather his son forget him completely. This stems from John's deep-seated insecurities. After his wife left, he raised their son alone, on an ordinary cleaner's wage. While other children live in large houses with floor-to-ceiling windows and floors covered in toys, he has to scrape by just to buy a toy car his son has wanted for a long time. Furthermore, when he is busy working, his son is left to play all by himself. What makes him feel even more guilty is that while other children are dropped off at kindergarten by their mothers, Michael is the only exception. John feels useless because he cannot provide a good life for his son. Therefore, he is initially very satisfied with the first family introduced by the adoption agency and eagerly highlights Michael's strengths. The wealthy and seemingly kind couple has already prepared a private bedroom for Michael and, upon hearing he loves dogs, promised to buy him a puppy. The prospective mother clearly adores the boy and is eager to finalize the adoption immediately. John genuinely believes that living with this family would give Michael a wonderful childhood and a fulfilling life, but a single remark from the prospective father instantly shatters that thought. Even before the adoption is finalized, the man is already referring to Michael as his own son, which makes John slightly uncomfortable. More importantly, he senses that the man is somewhat overbearing and might force his own expectations onto Michael. The prospective father's subsequent remarks confirm this fear. He intends to transfer Michael to a new kindergarten and has already mapped out his entire primary and secondary education, completely ignoring John's protests that Michael is perfectly happy and has many friends at his current school. Exhausted physically and mentally from searching for the perfect family, and tormented by his work and illness, John often collapses into sleep the moment he gets home. Yet, when his son walks in with a storybook, he forces himself up to read to him just like always. They spend their days soaking in the sun, watching excavators, doing crafts, and playing games, as John deeply cherishes their dwindling time together. Watching another father help his son get dressed after playing soccer fills his eyes with envy, knowing he will not live long enough to see his own son grow up. Unaware of this tragic reality, young Michael only knows he had a wonderful day playing with his dad, and he falls asleep peacefully on John's chest once they return home. A second candidate family is soon arranged. The couple is talkative, clearly adores children, but is unfortunately infertile. They have already adopted a daughter and are quite experienced in this regard. Instantly recognizing John's concerns, they promise to help Michael smoothly transition into their family while respecting his individuality. Although John finds them incredibly reassuring, he hesitates because the prospective father works as a postman. Since people rarely write letters anymore, the man faces a constant risk of unemployment, leaving John worried that they might not be able to provide Michael with long-term financial stability. After meeting 2 unsatisfactory families in a row, Michael seems to sense the tension and sits quietly in the backseat, looking sullen. John glances at his son, assuming the boy will soon forget these visits, and remains silent because he simply does not know what to say. However, he underestimates the emotional intuition of a 3-year-old. While young children may not understand complex situations, they can acutely feel the subtle emotional shifts of the people closest to them. The next day, John goes to his friend's house to pick up Michael. Typically, when John is overwhelmed with work, he asks his friend to pick Michael up from kindergarten, and the boy usually enjoys himself. Today, however, is different. Michael is not upset about his father being late. Rather, he is terrified that his father is going to abandon him. Realizing this deep-seated fear, John apologizes to his son and silently opens the car door. Prompted by his son's sudden outburst, John decides to gently explain the concept of death. He wants his son to understand that when the inevitable moment comes, it will not be a lack of love that takes his father away, but a tragic lack of choice. Pointing at a dead beetle, John tries to keep his tone light, as he explains that when a beetle dies, its body stops moving, and it can never eat or play again. He tells Michael that just like all living creatures, it is born, lives happily, grows old, and eventually passes away, leaving behind an empty shell. The beetle will not be sad, but John certainly is. As his own death rapidly approaches, he feels increasingly torn, desperate to find a suitable adoptive family quickly, yet terrified of finding one too soon. Staring at a mug gifted by his son that reads about him being the world's best dad, his eyes brim with an unbearable reluctance to let go. John's illness steadily worsens, making even simple tasks like peeling grapes for his son incredibly strenuous. Noticing his father's discomfort, Michael climbs onto a stool to fetch a glass of water, carefully carries it over, and affectionately snuggles up beside him. He holds his father's hand as if trying to comfort him. Yet, the more thoughtful and mature his son acts, the heavier the emotional burden on John becomes. The third candidates are a blended family, who have already adopted a large, chaotic brood of children of all ages. Although the parents promised that Michael would be their final adoption, the sheer chaos of the household prompts John to cross them off the list without hesitation. He seriously doubts the couple has enough energy to properly care for so many kids, and fears that Michael would easily be marginalized in such a crowded home. After visiting multiple homes, John cannot find a single family that puts his mind at ease, and he rapidly loses the confidence to keep searching. Desperate, he considers tracking down his ex-wife, hoping that having her return to raise their son might be the optimal solution. However, the agency staff gently reminds him that they are out of time, asking if he could genuinely trust the woman who abandoned them once before to never abandon Michael again. Unable to refute this harsh truth, John realizes how profoundly naive he had been to think finding an adoptive family would be easy. When faced with making the final choice, the crushing weight of responsibility bears down on him. He knows his decision will permanently shape the rest of Michael's life. Refusing to take even the slightest risk requires time, and time is exactly what he lacks the most. John's 34th birthday arrives in the blink of an eye, and he forces himself to gather enough energy to take his son grocery shopping. The two share a joyous afternoon, and watching Michael eagerly plant 34 candles into a homemade cake brings an uncontrollable smile to John's face. Yet, observing his father's sheer exhaustion suddenly reminds the young boy of the dead beetle. John wants to use this poignant moment to explain that he too will die one day, but gazing at his son's sweet face, he ultimately cannot bring himself to utter the words. The fourth prospective home leaves John with a terrible first impression. The house is completely unkempt, looking as though it has not been cleaned in ages. More alarmingly, the single woman explains that she got pregnant at 16, and when her furious parents demanded an abortion, she refused and carried the baby to term, only to have the child forcibly taken and put up for adoption. She deeply loved her baby and has lived with the regret ever since. Now physically unable to conceive but capable of making her own decisions, she wishes to adopt. Her husband adamantly opposed to the idea, which is why she now lives alone. Touched by the woman's brutal honesty, John opens up about why he is so fiercely critical of prospective parents. Raised by his own father until the age of 4, he spent the rest of his childhood bouncing between foster homes. Desperate to spare his son from enduring that same agonizing instability, he is determined to find a stable, reliable household. Thus, even though the woman clearly adores Michael and the boy seems comfortable with her, John decides he needs more time to consider the placement. Suffocating under the weight of an impossible decision, John visits his neighbor to vent his frustrations. The kind, elderly woman is one of his few friends, and he confesses to her that his lifelong survival rule has always been to never show weakness. Yet, whenever he drops Michael off at school and watches the other children being escorted by their mothers, he cannot hold back his tears, praying that no one notices his grief. The elderly woman looks at him tenderly, reassuring him that his tears are not a sign of weakness, but a profound expression of love. Even with her comfort, John struggles to accept the grim reality of having to give his son away. Having lost her own husband years ago, the old woman intimately understands his pain. She shares how deeply she misses her husband, reflecting on the decades they spent together and the beautiful memories they created. She explains that surrounded by a house full of his belongings, she feels as though she still speaks to him every day. In fact, it was not until last Christmas that she finally managed to throw away his old toothbrush. Hearing this heartfelt confession leaves John deep in thought. As John's physical strength rapidly deteriorates, simply climbing a ladder at work becomes an insurmountable task. When Michael sees his exhausted father fall asleep on the sofa, he thoughtfully retrieves a small blanket and gently covers him. Yet, witnessing his son's touching maturity only deepens John's sorrow. The fifth prospective family fills John with sheer rage. Although perfectly capable of conceiving, the woman refuses to have biological children, fearing pregnancy would ruin her figure, and she adamantly refuses to let motherhood trap her at home. To her, adopting a child is nothing more than seeking a brand new life challenge. Furthermore, they had originally planned to adopt an infant and even prepared a crib, making Michael feel like a mere backup option. The prospective father feigns affection for the boy and gives him a blue stuffed rabbit, but his every word betrays a fundamental indifference toward children. He simply views adoption as a charitable act that provides him with a sense of accomplishment. In reality, he is far more passionate about his model trains than he is about raising a child. While prioritizing their own lives isn't inherently wrong, it makes them entirely unsuited for parenthood. John is irritated but keeps his composure until the couple's appalling behavior at the door absolutely infuriates him. As they leave, the prospective parents casually ask Michael to return the stuffed rabbit. Both John and the social worker watch in stunned disbelief as a visibly hurt Michael obediently hands the toy back and politely says thank you. The couple's undisguised callousness abruptly makes Michael realize that all these recent visits have not been about his father trying to make new friends. Sitting in a cafe shortly after, John finally explodes in rage, demanding to know where the agency is finding these candidates, and declaring he wouldn't even trust them to raise a dog. The exhausting process has left John doubting his ability to judge these strangers, and painfully aware of how little he actually understands his own son's needs. In this mental state, making the right decision feels completely impossible, yet his rapidly failing body affords him no extra time. He can barely walk in a straight line anymore. Trying to vent his mounting despair, he fiercely kicks and punches a parked car, but his deteriorating muscles render his outburst pitifully weak. His appetite completely vanishes, leaving him unable to finish a small bowl of cereal, and when his son innocently tries to eat his leftovers, John ruthlessly stops him. John is utterly terrified of passing a virus to his son, but his sudden harshness combined with his uncontrollably trembling hands sends Michael into a state of extreme panic. Terrified that his father is going to grow old and die like the beetle, and equally terrified of being sent away to a fatherless home, the 3-year-old completely breaks down. Unable to articulate his complex grief, he resorts to crying and throwing a massive tantrum, hurling all of his clothes and toys out the door in a desperate attempt to make his father stay. Recognizing that his son is just processing an unbearable loss in his own way, John cannot find it in his heart to scold him. Instead, he smiles with deep, sorrowful understanding. Later that night, basking in the soft glow of the living room lamp, the two reconcile and peacefully draw pictures together just like old times. When John gently asks his son a question, the boy's response immediately reminds him of the single woman who had gifted Michael a handful of colorful hard candies, which the child happily loaded into his toy car. It becomes overwhelmingly clear that, subconsciously, Michael has already made his choice. John recalls the genuine, undeniable affection and hopeful anticipation radiating from the woman's eyes whenever she looked at his son, and after a long, contemplative silence, he finally makes his decision. The moment his mind is made up, a profound sense of peace washes over him. Though his heart still breaks at the thought of leaving, he is no longer afraid of death. Walking past a cemetery, he feels no sorrow, only a genuine, radiant smile. He immediately sells the car he has driven for decades and takes his son to an amusement park, paying to let Michael go on every single ride they previously could not afford. He hopes that in the future, when his son thinks of his father, his first thoughts will not be of death and sadness, but of this sheer beauty and happiness. Before delivering his son to his new home, John reflects on the elderly neighbor's wise words and decides to heed the agency's advice to create a memory box. He meticulously writes 15 letters for Michael to open each year on his birthday until he reaches adulthood at 18. Inside the box, he gently packs a cherished photograph of them together, the candles his son proudly lit for his birthday, his ex-wife's glove and photographs, along with his own window cleaning tools and work hat. Through this agonizing journey, John finally realizes that parental love is not solely dependent on material wealth, and he no longer feels inferior about his perceived uselessness. He hopes that whenever Michael looks at these keepsakes, he will remember exactly what his father looked like and find comfort in knowing he was never unwanted. Michael will always know he had a father who loved him endlessly, as well as a mother who once loved him. Early the next morning, John firmly holds his son's hand as they board a bus heading to the single woman's house. The moment the front door opens, the woman beams with radiant surprise, yet the normally polite Michael does not immediately return his new mother's enthusiasm. Instead, he turns his little head back to gaze at his father, whose brave smile completely fails to mask his terminal exhaustion and weakness. The sheer heartbreak reflecting in John's eyes reminds the boy of what his father had told him the night before. Very soon, his father would leave his physical body behind, just like the dead beetle. However, even when he could no longer be seen, his father promised he would remain right beside his son, watching over him forever.